The crack was under my left thumb when I picked it up, and the panel on Veth-Rack 7 said everything was sealed. I'd been re-shelving for the better part of the morning. Standard post-audit rotation, the Veth-Rack Certification Board, having finished their quarterly sweep the previous afternoon and signed off on all 46 specimen units in the xenobiology cataloging wing. The wing ran the length of the station's south face, which meant that by 10 in the morning, the skylights were pouring hard white planetary daylight across the shelving rows, and the specimen racks glowed clean and very still. The board had been thorough, as they always were. Their gray chitinous hands had moved across the racks with practiced efficiency. The four-armed lead auditor, Veth-Rack, reading instrument after instrument, his certification wand touching the lip of each seal and logging the reading before moving on. All clear. All clear. 46 times. That had been yesterday. This morning I was running the standard post-certification re-shelve. My own protocol, not the board's, not filed anywhere, not required by any accord standing order. I took each unit out of the rack by hand, turned it once, set it back in the right position. It wasn't something Ossivar's people did. They used the wand talked to the rack panel, the panel logged the result, and the result went into the certification record. Clean, fast, certain. I turned unit J714 and ran my left thumb along the lip of the seal, the way I had done 10,000 times across a 15-year posting. The crack registered under my thumb pad before my eyes found it. A hairline fracture, not quite a millimeter at its widest, running about a quarter of the way around the seal's lower edge. The kind of thing you wouldn't see straight on. The kind of thing that read intact to a wand pressed against the surface. Because the fracture ran parallel to the lip, and the wand was measuring vertical integrity, not lateral shear. I stopped. I held the unit still and tilted it slightly toward the skylight. The crack caught the light at a low angle and went white against the gray composite seal material. I could see it clearly now. The panel on Veth-Rack 7 showed green across all 46 positions. I set J714 down on the work surface, away from the rack, with the crack facing up. Then I reached for the station's general intercom and said, in a normal voice, that I needed the senior quarantine coordinator and whoever was currently lead for Orvanen Station's emergency protocols to come to the xenobiology cataloging wing. No alarm, no escalation tone. I have learned over the years that the fastest way to have a thing handled calmly is to call for it calmly. Then I waited. The unit in question was a Class II aerosol suspended biological sample, designated specimen Veth-Jar J714, collected from the surface of a deep stratum cave system on the station's survey moon 4 years prior. The Veth-Rack had catalogued it as a dormant spore colony of the genus Orvath secondary, inert at standard temperature and pressure, non-reactive to atmospheric nitrogen, cleared for standard archival storage. That was in the catalog. What was also in the catalog, in the secondary notes that the certification board's wand protocol did not require reading during a quarterly sweep, was a 6-year-old flagging by a now-retired Veth-Rack xenobiologist named Sev Orath, who had noted that Orvath secondary spore colonies had shown variable activation behavior in the presence of trace atmospheric compounds present in joint species stations running dual atmosphere life support. Orath had recommended a secondary aerosol barrier on any unit containing Orvath genus material. That recommendation had been superseded 2 years later by a board circular reducing the secondary barrier requirement to Class 1 units only, on the grounds that Class 2 specimens had never triggered an activation event in controlled testing. I had read Orath's note when the unit arrived. I had read the superseding circular. I had disagreed with the circular quietly and alone, in the way a person disagrees with a policy they cannot change, and I had continued running my thumb along the seals. Veth-Rack arrived in the wing 11 minutes after my call. He was accompanied by 2 members of his certification team and by Laren Vass, Orvanen Station's joint emergency coordinator, a tall, efficient woman in her 40s who had worked with me on 3 previous incidents, none of which had been anything close to a Category 0 event. Ossivar looked at J714 sitting on the work surface. He looked at the rack panel showing green. He looked at me. "You've pulled this unit from the rack," he said. I have. The certification record shows a clean seal on J714. It was WAN certified yesterday at 1432. I know. The panel still shows clean. He stepped to the work surface and pressed his certification wand to the lip of the seal. The wand gave its confirmation tone. He turned his primary visual organs toward me with an expression I have come to recognize across 15 years of working with Veth-Rack personnel. It was the expression of a being who has been called to a location where no instrument confirms a problem, and who is beginning to calculate whether the call was a mistake or a misread. "Dale Eris," he said. "The instrument reads clear." "Yes," I said. "Tilt the unit toward the skylight. Angle it so the light comes from below the lip. Look at the lower quarter of the seal." He did not do this immediately. He looked at the wand, then at the panel, then at me again. Laren Vass had moved to stand on the other side of the work surface. She was watching the unit. "Veth-Rack," she said, not loudly. "Tilt it." He tilted the unit toward the south-facing skylight. The crack caught the high white planetary light and went white along its length, clean and unmistakable. A quarter of the seal's lower circumference, a hairline fracture that ran parallel to the lip and read as intact to anything that measured from the top. There was a silence in the wing that lasted several seconds. Osavar said nothing. One of his certification team members made a sound that I later understood was a Veth-Rack involuntary response to the recognition of contained risk. Laren Vass had already moved to the wing's emergency panel and was pulling up the station's atmospheric flow diagram. I already knew what she would find. The xenobiology wing shared its atmospheric circulation with the station's joint species common corridor, a long, well-trafficked space connecting the Veth-Rack residential section to the human quarters and the shared laboratory level. It was not sealed from the wing. Under standard operating conditions, it did not need to be. If J714 had been re-shelved without detection, it would have remained in the rack under the conditions that Orath had flagged 6 years ago. Trace atmospheric compounds, dual life support environment, Class 2 seal on a unit containing a spore colony that had been assessed as inert without full activation compound testing. How long before the fracture propagated to breach was a question I could not answer precisely. Long enough that nothing would have shown on any instrument until the aerosol was already in the circulation system. A Category 0 biological release into a joint species station with 412 personnel, no advance warning, and no containment protocol activated. Laren Vass said quietly, "I'm calling a wing seal." She keyed the panel. The xenobiology wing's blast doors closed with a soft hydraulic sound that I had heard in drills but not, in 15 years, in earnest. The next 2 hours were procedurally straightforward, in the way that emergencies managed correctly are straightforward. The unit was transferred to a double barrier containment vessel by 2 technicians in full coverage suits. The rack was swept manually, not by wand, by myself and a Veth-Rack technician, Osavar assigned, who understood after 30 seconds of watching me why we were using our hands. We found nothing further. The unit was decommissioned according to Class 0 protocols, sealed in a tertiary vessel, and moved to the station's deep quarantine bay. Orvanen Station's chief medical officer, a Veth-Rack named Reth Sorvan who I had worked alongside for 9 of my 15 years, reviewed Orath's original notation and filed a formal correction to the board's Class 2 secondary barrier circular. The wing was cleared and opened after full atmospheric flush at the 4-hour mark. At the 6-hour mark, Veth-Rack came back to the xenobiology cataloging wing. I was re-shelving Veth-Rack 7, the remaining 45 units, in sequence, by hand. He stood at the end of the row and watched me work. I did not stop working. After a while, he said, "The wand is calibrated to manufacturer specification. It passed its quarterly calibration 7 days ago." "I know," I said. "The panel sensor passed its quarterly calibration 4 days ago." "I know that too." "The fracture geometry," he said, "runs parallel to the lip surface. The wand measures vertical seal integrity across the closure axis." A pause. "It would not detect a lateral shear fracture." "No," I said, "it wouldn't." I turned unit J76, ran my thumb along the seal. Clean. Set it back in the rack. "How did you find it?" he asked. I picked up J77. I ran my thumb along the seal. That is not in any protocol I am aware of. No, I said. It's not. He was quiet again. I worked through J78, J79. The instrument said it was sealed, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. It was the sound of a being who has built a career on the reliability of instruments, encountering a result the instruments did not predict. The instrument was right, I said. As far as the instrument was designed to measure, the seal was intact across the closure axis. The fracture was lateral. The instrument has no parameter for that measurement. That's not the instrument's fault. Then what do you have? Osavar said. That the instrument does not. I turned the unit in my hand. I had been doing this long enough that the answer was not something I had thought about in years. It was just the reason I ran my thumb along the seal. 15 years of touching them, I said. I set the unit back in the rack. Osavar stood at the end of the row for a moment longer. Then he said, carefully, the corrected certification will note that J714 was identified for manual inspection by Orvanen Station's human archivist prior to a potential containment failure. The board's certification record will reflect that the lateral fracture was not detectable by standard wand and panel protocol. That's appropriate, I said. The notation will also reflect that a modification to the wand measurement axis is under review. I nodded. He left. I finished re-shelving Veth-Rack 7. 45 units, each one turned, each seal run under my left thumb, each one set back clean. The daylight from the skylights had shifted to the late afternoon angle. Warm now. Long across the shelving rows, the specimen jars lit amber and still. Veth-Sorvan stopped by the wing on her way off shift. She stood at the end of the row and looked at the rack. Osavar told me you found it with your thumb, she said. I did. She was quiet for a moment. Veth-Sorvan had a particular quality among the Vethali I had worked with. She was interested in human procedural instincts, in the way that a good scientist is interested in anything that doesn't fit her existing model. She asked questions with patience and wrote down the answers. He also told me, she said, that you re-shelved the rack by hand afterward. Every unit. Yes. Not with the wand. Not with the wand. She thought about this. Because you don't trust the wand now? I trust the wand for what it measures, I said. I always will. But I'm the archivist. The rack is mine. I checked the last unit, set it back in its position. I run my thumb along the seals. Veth-Sorvan looked at the rack for a moment, and at me, and at my hands. Then she said something I did not have a response for. How many times do you think you have done that? Across 15 years? I thought about it. 46 units per rack, 6 racks in the wing, quarterly re-shelves, spot checks, intake rotations. I don't know, I said honestly. I lost count somewhere around year 4. She made a note on her pad. She said she would include it in the corrected ORATH filing. I turned the wing lights to overnight setting. They dimmed to a low blue-white, the specimen jars going dark and still in their rows, and walked out through the blast door into the corridor. The station was running evening cycle. The common corridor was quiet, personnel moving in small groups, the recycled air carrying the compound scent of 2 species life support systems doing their work. 412 people. The crack had been there when the board certified the rack. It had been there for some time before that, probably, long enough for the fracture geometry to settle and the composite to stop moving. The instruments had not been wrong. The instruments had been right about everything they were built to measure. They had simply not been built to run a thumb along a seal. I have thought about this since, in the way I think about most things in this line of work. Methodically, without urgency. The Vethali are careful and precise and thorough, and their instruments are better than anything I could have built. I do not think I am smarter than their instruments, and I do not think I have better judgment than Veth-Osavar, who has been certifying specimen racks for longer than I have been alive. I think I have hands, and I think that after 15 years, my hands know something about the feel of a seal that no instrument has been built to measure yet, and I think that is worth something, not more than the instruments. Alongside them. The crack was under my left thumb when I picked it up. The panel said clear. I wrote it up in the shift log before I went to bed, because a thing like that deserves to be in the record.